Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending this panel. As you know from the previous discussion, anti money laundering is a serious topic. It's something that needs exploration. I think that's what we have our esteemed guests for, to really delve into this topic. So I'll get right into it, and especially understanding what we're talking about when we speak of anti money laundering in today's world, with the inclusion of newer technology. Just like with all technology, it's a double-edged sword. With new solutions, you also get new problems. And I'll pose that question first in terms of what are the new anti-money laundering. Sorry, what are the money laundering methods that are being incorporated today, given the new technology that's out there? I mean, from I remember back in the day, I keep giving the example of the Nigerian prince sending an email trying to get his assets out of the country, and he needs your help to be able to move those assets for him, and then there goes your money. So yeah, how's that changed since then? And I'll put that,
Thank you very much, Salim. Really a pleasure to be here. I think we are seeing an increasing number of obviously cybercrime. So identity theft is quite common now, and a few interesting things that are happening with the technology. Now you have generative AI, so you can pretty much build with deepfake videos and voice recognition, everything else, to mimic somebody's identification and controls. You can actually, there have been instances where people have been called, again, as a police, I'm calling from the police, something has happened and we need your details, and you provide the details. A few of those have been happening in Australia and Western Europe as well, where people are actually calling with the deepfake voice mimicry, and then you'll call somebody's mother, and you'll say you're in the children's voice, and then you say, "Oh, mom, I need some help. Can you give me this detail, that detail?" And people cannot figure it out, and then suddenly you divulge the information, and then you find out half an hour later that your bank account is no longer what it used to be. So a lot of that is happening. I think the key thing is education. Definitely, we have seen, and I can give a personal example where one of our colleagues was asked by me, which I never did, to go to the Apple store and basically generate and get cards worth of 10,000, because I want to distribute those cards to my colleagues as a gift. And that person actually went to the Apple store, but they had the smarts to actually call me and ask me whether I'd ask for that. So a lot of this is happening, and people are getting very, very sharp with that. So education is, I think, very, very important. Doesn't matter what technology you use. If people are aware of what is happening and what they need to ask, it definitely helps.
Mm-hmm. And it seems like as well that they're able to get information that's out there, with data, to get little bits of information about you, just enough to convince you that they are the authority that they're presenting as, and then to collect more of that information. That seems a bit different out there as well, because with the amount of data that we're putting out there on the internet, and every time like you log on somewhere and then it says, "Oh, do you volunteer your data rights?" To an extent, I mean, you can't read so many pages of legal language to say yes or no, but a lot of the time that's becoming public information, and that can be used against you. And I'm wondering if there are any other examples in terms of with the decentralization aspect. Is that contributing to this to the problem of money laundering, where things can be done remotely? It doesn't. You mentioned the calls. Are there other ways as well? Just exploring, to understand more of what we're talking about when we say anti money laundering in today's world. I'll pose that to the other guests.
Definitely, Salim, thank you very much. So from a decentralization perspective, I think coupled with everybody's anxiety and urgency for speed in services, speed in capability, efficiency in whether it's your financial services, whether it's turnaround time to open a bank account, to process a payment, etc. Speed is a catalyst, I think, of what we're all looking for in today's day and age. And when you marry decentralization with the consumer's expectancy of speed, I think there is a gateway and a sweet spot in between where the opportunity comes in for compromise of control frameworks that have traditionally been in place to work as efficiently as they have been before. The turnaround time for identity verification checks is much swifter. We now have instant payment where payment is processed and settled within 10 seconds. The ability to do proper due diligence, to be able to understand whether that's legitimate or illegitimate transaction, goes away, and you can only do it after the fact in all reality. So I think with that speed is one impediment, if you like, to us relying upon the historical capabilities that have been in place before. And then back to the question around decentralization, most of us today have got your traditional bank account, and then you've got a mobile wallet sitting on your phone, and then you may have a crypto wallet, and then you may have a third or fourth maybe foreign bank account back in your home country, wherever you reside. And so that fragmentation of your financial portfolio gives any one of the providers that service you an inability to understand the totality of your profile and properly understand whether or not you bring risk to the institution. And with that decentralization creates the opportunity for you as a consumer or an illicit consumer to paint the picture that best suits them to the institution. The financial institution, albeit that they're doing to the best extent possible thorough due diligence, is compromised by not having a full picture because of the decentralization.
Exactly, and then leading on the side of regulation, because it seems like to be able, to get the complete picture, there's a need for partnerships. There's a need for even keeping up with the technology itself and understanding how it works. Because from what you were saying, it sounds like still the same problem is the one that it's always been human error, right? That's where the exposure is, when it comes, whether getting information from an individual or, something that's being overlooked. So I'll direct this to Tim. How do you see the regulation keeping up with the advancement of these technologies, which seem to be rampant and being applied? Then how do regulators keep up? How are they monitoring the situation to develop the counter tools for it?
Yeah, thanks, Alan. I'd just like to start by saying thanks to all of you for being here. You could be downstairs listening to Kevin O'Leary right now, but you chose us, and I appreciate that. So as a regulator, the way I look at this is, we all know that historically regulation struggles to keep up with technology. Technological developments happen quickly, but the legislative process is slow. And even once you have regulation, there's an inertia around trying to or thinking about amending the legislation. And a good example of where I think we've failed to regulate an emerging technology at the moment is social media. If you look around the world, there's very little regulation of social media. There's no requirement for social media companies to be transparent about their algorithms, for example. There's no age gating for minors and things like that. But I think we are making progress in this regard. When it comes to financial crime, although we take traditional regulatory tools and methods like KYC, transaction monitoring, CDD, and so on, and try and apply that to financial companies that are using tech, we're also looking at new methods and new ways of regulating this. It's an emerging space, but when it comes to digital assets, for example, we have the travel rule now, which requires beneficiary and originator information to travel with digital assets transfer. So we are moving and adapting. There's always probably going to be a lag, but in order to tackle that, I think we need people on the technology side to consider perhaps a career change and moving to regulation, moving to being policymakers, legislators, or at least working with us to help us understand these new technologies. Because we can't design and build the right regulations to try and keep up with the new risks and harms that they pose unless we understand the regulations.
And I'm curious as well about with firms and having like the department necessary to be able to have this oversight and incorporating the talent and skills to be able, since it seems like this type of skill set, it's, as you said, it's newer, it's You need something that combines different skills from, whether finance and security. Is that something that you're working on as well? Like, say, working with companies to say, this is the type of talent you need, this is the type of I guess of structure you need in a company, to be able to effectively keep an eye out for such things.
We're not in ADGM saying that at this stage, saying that you need to identify and hire certain kinds of talent. From a regulatory perspective, what myself and my colleagues are trying to do actually is look at how do we skill up ourselves in the best way to oversee this. And so we're using a combination of approaches from our own training and training on technology to hiring tech experts and training them to be regulators. It's through a combination of these means.
And from the talent side of things as well, that always seems to be the area where it's lacking in terms of, as you said, that it's something, how do you transfer those skills? I mean, how important is it to find the necessary talent to be able to address these cybersecurity issues, given that the technology is something that's still advancing, and it's not something that you can learn in school and university because it's still too advanced that by the time it gets to university, it's going to be old information. So how do you really bridge that gap in getting the right people with the right talents to address these cybersecurity or money laundering issues? I'll put that out there to the group.
Yeah. So thanks again for being here, just like everyone else has said. I think on the talent side, it's interesting because a lot of the people like myself and Jan Zabe and everybody else on this panel are trying to hire, they've got an option. Now, I think we talked a little bit about effectively armchair fraud, where people can do things without being accountable. And therefore, you can have people work on the other side and earn just as much money, if not more money. And so there's a big challenge there where when you're hiring people, the level of DD that you have to do on them to begin with, and then continuously, you're almost looking over people's shoulders pretty much all the time when they're working on systems that are trusted by some of the biggest banks in the world. You need to make sure that they stay on the right side of the law, which is very, very challenging. I think just something else as well, in terms of the conversation from earlier on, information social engineering, I think, as Jan Zabe was describing, where people are tricked into doing stuff. It's interesting that combined with regulation and policy, because I read a stat just last night. I was preparing for this talk. I thought about do some interesting reading to give people something useful. There was a study done in the UK by an organisation known as CIFAS, which is the fraud organisation for all the banks that share information. 1 in 7 British adults, 14% of people, admitted to committing fraud, first-party fraud. Wow. So now that we're all aware of the fact that regulators and policymakers are reimbursing us, and we know that fraud is going on and it's proliferated, people are going, well, you know what? I'll have my own shot at armchair fraud. I'll buy something, and I'll then call the bank up and say I don't recognise it. And what's happening as a result is the burden then is coming back to the institution to have to prove that this was you. Salim, you did this transaction. And AI, I guess, is an interesting thing. It means many things to many people. But there's one thing, detecting if this is an impersonator. Because most of us, when we think about fraud, we think it must be somebody that's taken over Zia's account that's just performed that action or executed that transaction. But what happens increasingly now is that a lot of our clients are coming to us and saying, we don't believe that this was a fraudster. We think this was the real person, but help us prove that this was the real person. And so there's a lot of introspection that has to go on with this. And, when you set policies and regulations, the emergent behavior from that sometimes can be not what you expect it to be. And so,
definitely. If I can jump in here. So I think a couple of things we talk about, right? So there are 3 aspects here. One, obviously, the technology has to get to a point where most of the institutions are not significant enough to deploy AI. currently, right? So large institutions can, smaller institutions cannot. Deployment of, for example, AI, but if you have large data sets to what Jay is saying, build algorithms that can detect actual fraud versus sort of a crime, that makes a big difference. This also comes to the point of getting people together. How do you hire the right talent? Talent is the era of cheap money. What has done to actually talent is that everybody has become extremely expensive, and it becomes very, very difficult to hire and retain people. And I'm sure everybody has the same challenges. So you put that together with the fact that people sort of saying, okay, there's a top 1% of the world doing really, really well, and that the income gap is increasing, which gives people more incentive to say, okay, well, I can kind of commit a little bit of fraud, and your morality becomes a bit relative. So these things are happening. And then you have these technologies about quantum computing and AI. So if you can, and I think you'll have to manage the access to quantum computers, otherwise you'll have a significant disaster on your hands, at least in my humble opinion, because you can break the encryption in 8 hours, the highest level of encryption in 8 hours.
Can you explain that actually, like what is quantum computing and how that would be a game changer in the field if it gets to that point where that's accessible?
Yeah, so basically quantum...
Briefly, of course.
In simple terms, concept. Quantum computing is very simply so if you can do a calculation at one time with defined parameters, you cannot do... So there's a capacity issue. But if you can replicate basically, and that's what quantum mechanics is, you can replicate the same thing in two different places. Two things appear at the same time in two different places, and you can run simultaneous calculations on both sides, but with different or corresponding results. That's what quantum computers allow you to do. So the ability to process large, very, very large sums of data very, very quickly will give you the ability to break anything, build anything. And then with generative AI, so I can create Tim if I have access to a quantum computer, and potentially Tim's web persona in about 2 hours. Without
very
ever, without ever.
Scary.
No, sorry, not for you, but I mean, it's be able to create a human being and a personality.
But that's a very scary thought, right? So it's an access issue. But again, if you can create something like this, if you can break everything, you can also build something to protect against that. So a lot of this is happening, and I have children, so I'm actually concerned about my kids, because they're going to grow up in a world where there's a lot of things that are going to be happening, and we need to educate them. And when it comes to regulation, regulators can only provide principles. The moment regulators get into actual compliance with very specific action items, you are asking for troubles, because then you have to keep up with the technology, and I don't think it's
always going to be outdated.
Technology is always going to be further ahead than regulations.
Yeah, I mean, those were like, I think that is a very scary concept. Not you directly, Tim, but just being able to create a personality that can, in the examples you were describing earlier, to get that information that adds more, to the trust, that on the other end of the call, as we generally just do everything remotely, give that type of information. And what Zia was saying as well about even who you hire matters. I was asking about particularly, like, do they have the skill sets to do the job? But then that's another thing. Can they walk out with information? And where's the protection against that? And also on the consumer side, they're committing fraud, or they have the possibility to. And I like how you said relatively. I think those are very nice euphemism for a lot of people are taking advantage of that, and whatever loophole they can find, to take advantage of the system. And then of course, when they can't prove it, with the AI that exists at the time, then they just have to cover the costs, and that contributes to financial crime. So it seems like all in all together there's a lot of education, there's a lot of systemic development that needs to take place, with incorporation of AI. And I wanted to understand a little bit, like as you know, like with the news of FTX and this week, with Binance, in terms of what does that signal to the industry when you hear these types of because is it the human side of the corruption that's the issue, the regulation that didn't catch up in time, when talking about these types of business practices, what message does that give to the industry as a whole?
I'm going to say something very controversial on this, right? So greed drives a lot of stuff. In case of FTX, particularly in crypto, especially the original days, right? Everybody was speculating. And if I ask someone that if I can make you 1,000% in a month, that in itself should give you a pause to do that. And then if I don't give my $100 to a corner bank that I don't have trust in, how am I sending $10,000 to somebody in the Bahamas, right? So so again, I think people are unfortunately not taking responsibility for their own actions as well. You can't really just look at the governments and regulators and say, by the way, you should be fixing this. All new businesses, if you look at comparable things, I mean, what happened with Lehman and Bear Stearns? That's a very well-established industry, well-established. So you can't really say, okay, well, because FTX, everybody is, all the regulators are to blame. Personally, I wouldn't trust a guy wearing shorts in a conference. If I came here wearing shorts and everybody else was in a suit, I would not give that guy money. So there were signs everywhere.
Because we're getting old.
Should have worn a tie at least, to improve that image. But no, I see what you mean. And
can I jump in on that
please,
point? Because it touches on something that I've been thinking about a lot lately, and that's corporate governance. And I think legislation, regulation will always struggle to keep up with technology. But something that's not new is corporate governance. It's always been around. And if you look at all these failings, among other things, they were massive failings of corporate governance. And so in a world in which technology is advancing as fast as it's advancing, and where we may not have the regulations yet, or we may never have the regulations that are sufficient to regulate this, one of the fallbacks that we can think about is corporate governance. What happened to the board in these companies? Wirecard, FTX, Lehman's, you name it.
But I mean, on that point, I mean, how do you actually implement, proper corporate governance then? Because that was going to be my follow-up question in terms of, yes, it's not all on regulators and, regulations that exist, because as we had mentioned, the technology is going to be more advanced. It's going to be implemented in practice, well before, those are put in place. As you mentioned, social media, that's something that's still not regulated today, and that's been, around for a while. So how would you advise whether you're talking to the consumer, whether you're talking to the person, in a firm or a company, how do you manage this and the balance of the two?
Well, when it comes to firms or just corporates, conscious run out of time as well, but you need people who are on the board, for example, your non-execs, that type of thing, to understand the business. A lot of the time you have on boards money people who gave you some cash and they want to join your board, but they don't understand your business whatsoever. And so sometimes that can help because it lets you go off and do things that you need to get done. But in other instances, I think from a governance point of view, you need people who understand the ins and outs of what you're doing, to what the guys that were on the previous discussion were talking about. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, there's BBB, bullshit baffles brains, basically. There's a lot of that goes on.
Right.
So, yeah.
I like the phrase. And Abigail, I believe you touched on the talent aspect as well, if you want to chime in there.
Yeah, but if I just pick up on the corporate governance aspect, I think transparency of information is a catalyst to proper corporate governance. So, I mean, at large, most entities and most corporates that exist want to do the right thing and stand for the right thing and put in place ethical boards and people of good standing. And so at a decision-making level, whether it's at a C-suite or at a board level within most organizations and entities, that decision-making, for the most part, seeks to be ethical. It seeks to want to make decisions that are in the best interest of running a clean business and contributing to the greater good of society. But that can only be done with transparency of information. And often there's a lack of information and a lack of understanding. And I think the convergence of information between regulators, the public sector, law enforcement officials, and the private sector, in order to harness the collective understanding of what it is we're dealing with, so that decision makers have access to more intuitive information, is what will help to foster that transparency and help to foster a way in which business can make sure that they are on the right side of the law and they're not contributing to facilitating illicit activity. I think that's one thing. If I come back to your question on the talent, essentially what we find, I mean, I call myself a little bit in a way from the dinosaur age, right? If you think about from a financial crime compliance professional perspective, I've been doing this work for about 20 years now, and I come from the era of lawyers that were selected to do this, right? And for 10 years post my time, when we looked for the pool of talent on who's going to be financial crime compliance professionals, we looked in the pool of lawyers. And I think in today's day and age, if you guys are just looking at law graduates as your pool of talent for to help you fight financial crime, you're looking in the wrong place, right? You need to be looking for data science experts, engineers, technology experts, AI experts. And I think that the talent pool and the capability and the skill set that is needed to better understand the evolution in the fundamental predicate offense that threaten our institutions is what we need to think about differently. And so from a talent perspective, we see a lot of recycling in the market of compliance professionals moving from one entity to another. That doesn't necessarily bring about change, and it doesn't make the ecosystem stronger. I think the introduction of new capabilities and new skill sets is what is needed for us to become better at fighting this.
Yeah, and I think a key thing that you said was about the, even before the rules and the laws can, come in place, it's the culture of corporate conduct established, and that needs to be understood and practiced by everyone to ensure transparency, ethical practice. And there's so much more that we can speak on this, but we are out of time. So I just want to thank all our panelists for this very insightful conversation. And thank you for attending. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.